Hello all you folklore loving cosmonauts, as always I am Cosmic and today we're going to be reviewing Torn Tales, which is an ARPG brought to you by Twistplay and published by Chilled Mouse. Now the game was something that I had previewed a while back and particularly didn't leave a good first impression with me, mainly due to not only the visual state of the game and technical state of the game, but also due to its core gameplay elements. So for those who are unaware what Torn Tales is all about, it is essentially a game where you lead a party of 3 heroes on their quest to basically repair their own folklore legends. What has happened as essentially a bookbinder has decided to cast a magical spell because none of his written stories are liked and no one likes his folklore legends, and he gets jealous of the folklore legends, so he casts a spell and decides to rewrite them into his own image, and so the goodies are going to be baddies and everything's going to not be as it seems, and so you are then put in the place of Robin Hood, Snow White and Dr. Jekyll, and these 3 must repair the damage done to the fantasy realm. It's a game that on its premise, on its story premise alone, works really well, and I really find the idea interesting of rewriting classic folklore tales into something completely different. I like having, the ability to play as Robin Hood, Snow White and Dr. Jekyll in the same universe. It is a lot of fun, and I think that on that premise the game does really well. The story itself is told by a narrator and the voice acting is pretty okay for the most part. It reminds me of listening to an audiobook where it's pretty much the same actor doing all of the voices but in slightly different tones and pitches, and while some people may not like that, if you compare it to that of something like an audiobook, it does work very well, and I thought that the narrator himself did a good job for the most part. But let's get down to the mechanics of the game. Now the mechanics of the game are fairly straightforward. You have your 3 heroes and you essentially can attack move or passive move. So passive move is green and that just means you move your characters. An attack move means that you will move to that location and attack at the same time. Now attacking works very simply. It's all auto attack. Your basic attacks are all auto attacks, so there's no real need to click anything other than the target that you want to click. Your character has various abilities and also has equipable items that have abilities that you can use. The skill trees are somewhat varied from character for character in terms of the abilities that they have, because obviously Snow White is magical, so she has access to various mage spells. Robin Hood has an access to a variety of both ranged and melee skills because he has both a bow and sword. So each character does play differently, has different roles within the makeup itself, but I wouldn't say that the skill tree is extensive in any way. There's only maybe 5-6 abilities in total to unlock, and then you can morph those abilities with various different passive upgrades that will change the ability in some way. But again, it's not extensive as I would have liked it to be. While it isn't as extensive as I would have liked it to be, it does its job. It works as intended. There's a good range of abilities. Each character is different. Each character has different roles, strengths and weaknesses. So for the most part, it's fairly well designed in that regard. The biggest flaw in the game comes in the form of the combat. Now the way the combat works is very simple. You click on a target, you attack, it auto attacks, and then you can use your various skills and abilities as and when you see fit once their cooldown is finished, which on its own, on paper, I don't have a problem with, and indeed I have liked games who have had similar combat such as Champions of Antaria. The problem is that this is a complete and solo ARPG. The difference with Champions of Antaria was that it was a blend of ARPG, tactics, and of course you had the base building. This game has none of that. It is combat all the way through. There is nothing else to do, which means what ends up happening is the combat not only feels repetitive, but it also feels shallow, because you only have a limited number of skills. Your combat is pretty much standoffish for the most part because you're not actually actively engaged in the attacking section other than to activate your skills and abilities. So it's standoffish ARPG combat and there is no other gameplay element to the game, and thus it feels very repetitive and at points can be really tiresome. It just makes you feel tired after a while because all you're essentially doing for the most part is watching the bloody screen and not actually interacting. Now, the majority of the problems with the combat would be forgivable if the level design had backed it up, but the level design does not back it up in any way. So the way the levels work is they are for the most part fairly linear. There is a little bit of exploration, but not particularly that much. Not only are the levels aesthetically not that pleasing, it's very old, dated looking assets in there, but you have groups of enemies. You have no spontaneity to the actual game itself. You just go along in these linear levels and there will be groups of enemies placed around until you reach the end of the level, and then the occasional boss, and the boss battles for the most part are relatively fun, I guess. But again, there's no, the world feels shallow. It lacks any kind of depth. Most of the world and the levels within that world are fairly devoid of any kind of life. It would have been nice to explore this world and this fantasy world and see things from, you know, the tales themselves or the folklore, but it's not. Like, for example, one of the first levels you go on is the Sherwood Forest Woods. There's nothing in there. There's nothing. There's a few huts, but for the most part there's nothing in that level to see. The second level is the swamps. There's nothing that much to see in there either, and the game continues like this with these really boring and dull levels that offer little to no challenge. Which brings me nicely on to difficulty of the game, because the difficulty of the game is probably my biggest gripe to date, and the reason is that if you are correctly leveled, it is ridiculously easy, but for some reason that I cannot pinpoint why, the game decides to bump the difficulty ridiculous amounts for no apparent reason and at random locations. So for example, when you are correctly leveled, you will destroy everything with ease, with absolute and utter ease. It is so easy, this game. But the game decides, oh hey, I see your characters are level 9, 8 and 8. And the enemies on that level were 9, 8 and 8, pretty much in that region, right? And then you decide to go on the next level, and so the game decides to bump enemies up 3 or more levels for no reason at all, which means that I'm facing down level 11 or level 12 enemies with a level 9, a level 8 and another level 8, which means that my first group of mobs that are trash mobs, I will get absolutely obliterated. And it is ridiculously frustrating, especially because the way that the game is designed, if you want to play it from start to finish without having to go back to various sections, it means that there's no real way to grind because the levels are linear, there's no exploration, there's no respawn for enemies, so you can clear an entire level of enemies and still be underleveled for the next section, which makes no sense to me. And that for me just sums up Torn Tales. It's a really great idea, but something just got lost in its execution. The overall visuals of the game feel dated. The sound is for the most part relatively nice, but the visuals are dated. The actual implementation of the combat and the leveling system is just, it's off, it's old-fashioned, it's tedious, and I don't mind a game that is fairly traditional in its build style. The problem is that you have to do it correctly, and this game just isn't done correctly. I think it certainly needs balance patching, and for the most part it's a little bit of a letdown. You don't get to explore this interesting world where you've pitted Robin Hood, Snow White and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde together. There's no real camaraderie, there's no real dialogue other than the narrated sections. You don't go through a level with the characters talking to each other, so it just feels devoid of life. It feels shallow. There's a lack of depth, not only to the setting and story, but to the core gameplay mechanics, and that is a real shame, because I think with the story and setting and the idea behind this game, you certainly had potential for a fantastic indie ARPG, but what is here, I have to say, I cannot recommend to people. I think that it would just frustrate traditional, more hardcore players of ARPGs, and for newcomers, it is just not solid enough to really put this as your first game into ARPGs. So that is my review of Torn Tales. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, make sure to share on social media, and make sure that you subscribed, and as always, I will see you next time.